Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Pierre Bourdieu, video 2. In this video, I've got three goals. First, I'm going to give you some more examples of Bourdieu's sociology of position and disposition to show you why it's so important to sociological theory. Next, I'm going to look to the Jenkins article that you read to look at clothing norms in the hospital. Finally, I'm going to get you ready for your two-paragraph response. Let's go! As I told you in the last video, Bourdieu gives us a set of conceptual tools to explore how class and various types of capital come to impact the educational environment. Here I want you to think about educational environment in a bunch of different ways. 1. In terms of the various cultural spaces where we deploy our level of education. 2. The various ways that education reinforces particular body habits, the types of grammar and the practices of imprinting it on young people. And 3. The types of behavior and symbolic practice that occurs in the school, university, or college itself. This is a broad understanding of education. Coming from humble provincial origins, Bourdieu wondered why so few people came to the university setting from there. The university system, and particularly the French university system, tends to reproduce itself. How? There's obviously the issue of cost and value. Those who have more education can afford it and pass it along. But Bourdieu will argue that this fails to understand the various other ways that people are siphoned away from higher education, about the class-based goals and educational outcomes shared within the population, and the reinforced skills in the upbringing of people entering into the university system, and so on. To think about the higher education market strictly in terms of economic capital subsumes all of these other explanations to one variable. But we can't think of this field solely in terms of its structural conditions, Bourdieu argues. We have, as well, a series of learned dispositions that emerge. Not all these are bad in the same way as these structural conditions seem to suggest. We learn things like typing, writing, citation, grammar, basic skills that we deem a social system like ours needs. But we also learn those skills that allow an economic system like capitalism to continue. Marx would only focus on the latter. Let's turn to academic culture more generally. Think also about the formalized way that you write course papers. Or, I should say, are supposed to write course papers. There is a logic to effective writing which higher education must deploy. We also develop particular ways of educated speech, fewer and ums included, that convey you have an education, that you went to this research-intensive university, and you were well read in terms of the world issues from the perspective of somebody with a university education. For some contrast, your instructor did his undergraduate at Carleton. Though it cost about the same as Queen's, at the time, that school had a very different student body, then and now. At either school, you will take a class in sociological theory, like this in 226 beforehand. We could read the same books at both schools, be taught the same skills at both schools, and excel at both schools. But marks of prestige and distinction remain. In this sense, class doesn't simply reproduce itself because of the average income of the Queen's graduate, this is surely part of it, but also the manner in which one navigates the symbolic economy, contained here and hereafter, in contrast to Carleton. Finally is the question of reflexivity. Here Bourdieu is using sociology to think about the practice of sociology. When Bourdieu speaks of reflexivity, he means a way of thinking and acting that takes itself as its object. In particular, his work on reflexive sociology is one that questions its own class biases and asks itself what gets considered knowledge in the academic setting. Bourdieu is taking aim at his fellow French Marxists, who would explain away the desires and needs of the working classes based on their social position. To Marxists, ideology simply distorts oppression. But we aren't just handed our class position, like at a school cafeteria line. We live and embrace it. This he calls the theory effect. A question: if class is performed, why do we perform it? Sociologists don't just mark class out there. They reproduce their own class position, both who they admit to the academic circle and also how they regard members of other classes. That is, I mean perform not to mean a costume, but in the way that academics distinguish their own class interests in relation to others, in the process of doing sociology. In this sense, Bourdieu is as critical of the academic life as he is of the wine consumption that I made fun of in the last video. My question to you, my prestigious Queen students, is whether after all of this symbolic struggle is cast away, how much sociology is left? Is there an objective social science remaining? Bourdieu seems to think so. Do you? Okay, so that's Bourdieu on education. A more fun example might be to think about the restaurant. Let's think about two right across the street from each other. Jack Astor's and Tango Nuevo, both on King Street. Here we'll see distinction at work and return to questions of habitus and disposition. How do you and the employees that you interact with act differently at Jack Astor's and Tango Nuevo? How are you greeted at the two different restaurants? And how do the individual servers act and dress? When you walk into Jack Astor's, usually a young lady wearing a tight black outfit with an earpiece gives you a gigantic smile. "How are we doing today, you guys?" she says, as if she's interested in what 8 guys my age wearing ill-fitting pants are doing. She asks if you're there to see the game. She clearly does not care, before sending you to someone's section. This is very different than the solemn greeting at the fancy restaurant, where they ask immediately if you have a reservation. The lights are low, and there is a book at the front with everybody's name very solemnly written down. The host is generally free to wear whatever they want, and the smile and eye contact is far more reserved. There is a mood to both places. Both casual, yes, but distinct. And if you go to any Jack Astor's at any tapas place in North America, you're going to get the same mood. This is Bourdieu's field. Just think of how I said tapas versus tapas. The menu is important too. We also have very different types of cuisine, both in style and presentation. At Jack Astor's, you know you can get the same pile of nachos at any location in the damn world. The portions are generous. You want a burger? There's 18 of them. Drink specials too. Any night of the week, you can get a different sugary drink served in a punch bowl at a discount. Or $6 beers, all summer long. You get a very different experience at your fancy tablecloth spot. There is a wine list, a small menu, usually rotating, featuring the chef's selection of the most delicious local ingredients. The plates, as you can expect, are small. Tapas, sharing style. Small, maybe shareable. There is a list for wine available by the glass of the bottle. You get to have descriptions of each of them, even ask for a taste if you want. There might be a drink feature, but no special. And don't order a Long Island iced tea. Not just drinks and dishes. Think about the ingredients. You can always ask where your duck confit was sourced. Not so with the nacho platter. Finally, the question of gender. Some people use this to critique Bourdieu. Let's take a look. I would also point you to the ways that the division of labor is gendered in these and almost all other restaurants. About the kinds of roles distributed to those of a particular gender, and who is present to public view and who is not. While most restaurants don't have explicit rules about who is in and who is out of view, or in a particular job, the reality is very different. So too are the forms of dress, habitual forms of action, and capital available to those who operate in the field. Many have asked if Bourdieu can sufficiently account for gendered norms. What is gender? Just a resource? A class? Just a bodily attribute? Subjective? Objective? Both? The importance of these questions will become evident later in the course, when we talk about Judith Butler. In sum, Bourdieu's position is that the restaurant industry is a site of symbolic struggle. Fine dining isn't simply fine because it's better than other forms of dining, but rather, going to the restaurant is an opportunity to deploy various forms of capital in particular fields, in various places where our habitual dispositions unfold. Let me show you another example, in coffee. This is my old buddy Alexis's shop on St. Clair West in Toronto, Wallace Espresso. I think that when we look to the way people consume coffee, we see habitus at work, in the way that workplace norms become embodied and social hierarchy is organized. Taste for particular brands of coffee represents one's place in the social hierarchy and how we mobilize different types of capital in our coffee preferences. So consider the different attributes, dispositions, and symbolic mechanisms at work at Tim Hortons versus Starbucks versus Wallace Espresso. Think about the clientele, the discussions you can have about your coffee. I'd like a double-double versus let's talk about mouthfeel, and the design of the restaurant. In each case, just like that of your two very different dining experiences, we see Bourdieu's capital, position, and disposition at work. Again, this is a very different understanding of capital than the one we read in Marx. For Bourdieu, cultural consumption is a place where we mobilize capital to navigate hierarchy. For Marx, it is a space of material life, where we have labor alienated and become what we are based on our proximity to the means of production. In English, the coffee shop is a site where capital is mobilized, for Bourdieu, on the symbolic economy. For Marx, it is where capitalism is reproduced through labor-capital relations. Both are talking about the same place, but from two very different angles. Finally, let's look to that Jenkins piece I got you to read, about clothing norms in the hospital setting. In the readings this week, Tanya Jenkins explores how Bourdieu can help us explore position and disposition in the healthcare setting. She asks us to look to the ways that social, cultural, symbolic, and economic capital are distributed through clothing norms. I like the piece because it gives us a plain language understanding of Bourdieu's terminology: capital, field, and habitus. She also brings it to the hospital. Despite the differences in the Canadian and American healthcare systems, I think it is very easy to see how applicable the analysis is. In Canada, just as the US, there is a significant income difference in the hospital's division of labor, but we find similar clothing norms in both spots, and plenty of Crocs, as you see here. I'd like to highlight Jenkins' use of symbolic efficiency in the piece. Bourdieu often talks about symbolic violence, and how classist norms exclude people from settings like higher education. In using symbolic efficiency, Jenkins illustrates that these cultural norms of dress aren't really a ruse. It's not just an ideological veil on the division of labor, as Marx would have it. Nor are they just a site of violence. As a field, the hospital mobilizes the forms of capital found in dress, and these norms are deployed by all members in the field to keep the institution running. They serve as a quick reference guide that members use to identify the social roles of hospital members, even ones who they haven't met. In the cases of admission to the emergency room, Jenkins is clear. We read on page 536. In an emergency, the symbolic efficiency of marking authority can be a matter of life and death. The point, then, is that clothing norms in this field are a site of distinction. I mentioned to you in the past video that in Bourdieu's major work, Distinction, he argues taste is a social product. And this is precisely what Jenkins does in terms of clothing in the hospital. Nobody is forced to stylize their scrubs or Crocs, and yet they do, and do so in ways that are identifiable with their wealth, their class, their level of education, etc. The hospital setting is the field, these inputs are the forms of capital, and the styles of dress reflect the habitus, the series of dispositions deployed in that setting. When you think of Bourdieu, keep the hospital in mind. That's it for me. Now it's your turn. In 2 paragraphs, between 5 to 8 sentences in length, 1. Explain what Bourdieu means by habitus and field. 2. Apply these 2 concepts, thinking about how Queen's undergrads display their social capital. Remember, a good answer will reference the readings. See you next week.